"Stop starring, if you want to touch it," said the wet alien woman. The air inside the Thalassan submersible was thick with the scent of salt and recycled oxygen, a sharp contrast to the sterile environment of the Halian flagship. Silas adjusted the seals on his tactical vest, his fingers moving with a rhythm born of 1,000 mechanical repairs. Across from him, Elara sat with a stillness that was unnerving, her skin a pale, luminous violet that seemed to catch the bioluminescent glow of the passing sea life. She was watching his hands, her large, dark eyes tracking every flex of his knuckles and every slide of his calloused skin against the metal buckles. To a Halian, such constant, unconscious movement was a waste of neural energy, yet she found herself unable to look away from the sheer vitality radiating from him. The silence between them was not empty. It was heavy with the weight of things left unsaid, and the friction of two biological philosophies colliding in a cramped titanium hull. "You are looking at my hands again, Princess," Silas said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the small cabin. He didn't look up from his work, but a small, knowing smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. "I am observing the erratic nature of human motor function," Elara replied, her voice like glass clicking against silk. She shifted her weight, the fabric of her iridescent gown shimmering as it clung to the curves of her lithe frame. "It is fascinating how much energy your species dedicates to unnecessary tactile interaction," she added, though her pupils dilated as he finally met her gaze. Silas let the buckle snap shut, the sound sharp in the quiet room. "It isn't unnecessary where I come from," Silas said, standing up. The movement was fluid, a predatory grace that forced Elara to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact. "We don't just see the world, Elara," Silas said, stepping closer until the heat from his body began to permeate the cool air around her. "We feel it, we manipulate it, and sometimes we just enjoy the way it pushes back," he whispered. The submersible suddenly lurched, a violent shudder groaning through the frame as an alarm began to wail. "The stabilization fins are locked," Elara said, her calm facade momentarily cracking as she checked the holographic display. "The pressure is exceeding the hull's threshold," she cried, her fingers hovering over the touchscreen in a frantic, yet delicate dance. Silas didn't hesitate, his human instincts overriding the protocols the Halians spent centuries perfecting. "Move," Silas said, his tone leaving no room for argument. He didn't wait for her to comply, instead reaching out and gripping her waist to slide her out of the pilot's seat. The contact was electric. The heat of his palms through her thin dress sent a shock through Elara's nervous system that her psychic dampeners couldn't handle. He dropped to the floor, ripping open a maintenance panel with his bare hands, the metal shrieking as he forced it aside. While Elara watched in a mix of horror and awe, Silas plunged his arms into the tangle of wires and high-pressure fluid lines. "You will be burned," Elara shouted, reaching out but stopping short of touching him. "The coolant is at a critical temperature," she warned, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Then it's a good thing humans have a high tolerance for discomfort," Silas grunted, his teeth bared in a grimace of concentration. He found the manual override, a heavy iron lever that had been seized by salt corrosion over decades. His biceps surged, the fabric of his shirt straining against the bulk of his shoulders as he poured every ounce of human stubbornness into the task. With a sickening crack of breaking rust, the lever gave way. The submersible leveled out, the groaning metal sighing into a steady hum. Silas stayed on the floor for a moment, his chest heaving, his hands covered in a mixture of hydraulic oil and his own blood where the metal had bitten into his skin. "You used your own body as a lever," Elara whispered, kneeling beside him. She reached out, her fingers trembling as they hovered just millimeters above the jagged cut on his forearm. "I've never seen a living being ignore the logic of pain so completely," she said, her eyes wide with a new kind of hunger. Silas looked up at her, the adrenaline still coursing through his veins, making his pulse visible in the column of his throat. "Pain is just data, Elara," Silas said, reaching up to cup her cheek. His thumb traced the line of her jaw, leaving a smear of dark oil against her violet skin. "But this," Silas said, pulling her slightly closer. "This is something else entirely," he murmured. Elara didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned into the warmth of his hand, her breath hitching. The Halian way was one of distance, of mental projections and sterile unions, but the raw, unadulterated presence of this human was shattering her composure. She felt the roughness of his skin, the micro-vibrations of his muscles, and the sheer, overwhelming reality of him. "Is this why your kind is so feared?" Elara asked, her voice dropping to a low, breathless register. "Because you refuse to be limited by the laws of biology," she wondered aloud. "Maybe it's because we're the only ones who know how to appreciate the biology we have," Silas said, his gaze dropping to her lips. He stood up, pulling her with him until they were chest to chest, the height difference forcing her to stand on her tiptoes. "You've spent your whole life watching the stars, Princess," Silas said, his hand sliding down to the small of her back. "But you've never actually touched the ground," he added. The tension in the cabin was no longer about the depth of the ocean or the failing machinery. It was a gravitational pull, a human force of nature that Elara found herself powerless to resist. She reached up, her own hands finally making full contact as she gripped the front of his tactical vest, pulling him down. "Show me," Elara whispered, her eyes burning with a fire that no Halian had ever dared to light. Silas didn't need a second invitation. He backed her against the smooth curve of the bulkhead, his movements firm and possessive. He kissed her with a hunger that was almost violent, a desperate exchange of heat and intent that left her gasping. It wasn't the polite, telepathic sharing she was used to. It was an invasion of the senses. She could taste the salt on his skin, feel the hardness of his body against her soft curves, and hear the frantic rhythm of two hearts trying to beat as one. "You are so loud," Elara gasped, her head falling back as he moved his mouth to the sensitive skin of her neck. "Your thoughts, your body, it is a constant roar," she cried out. "That's just the sound of being alive, Elara," Silas said, his hands moving with expert intent. He found the fastenings of her gown, his fingers working with the same mechanical efficiency he had used on the submersible, but with a tenderness that made her ache. As the fabric pooled at her feet, the cool air of the cabin hit her skin, but she barely felt it over the radiating warmth of the man before her. She was exposed, vulnerable in a way no Halian royal had ever been, yet she felt a strange sense of power in his reaction to her. Silas stopped for a moment, his breath hitching as he looked at her, his eyes roaming over the elegant lines of her body. "Stop starring," Elara said, a playful, yet demanding edge to her voice. She reached out, her fingers tracing the ridges of his abdominal muscles, marveling at the sheer density of him. "If you want to, touch it," she said, echoing his earlier sentiment. Silas chuckled, a dark, rich sound that sent shivers down her spine. "I plan on doing a lot more than just touching, Princess," Silas said. He lifted her easily, her legs wrapping around his waist as he carried her toward the small bunk at the back of the cabin. Every movement was a testament to human strength, a display of physical capability that made Elara feel both small and incredibly significant. He laid her down, his body hovering over hers, a mountain of muscle and heat. "The High Council would execute me for this," Elara whispered, even as she arched her back to bring herself closer to him. "Then we'd better make it worth the sentence," Silas replied, his voice a low growl of desire. The night deepened outside the submersible, the dark waters of Thalassa hiding them from the rest of the galaxy. Inside, the barrier between species was being dismantled, one touch at a time. Silas showed her the language of the skin, the way a certain pressure could elicit a certain sound, and how the human body was designed for the pursuit of pleasure as much as it was for survival. Elara found herself responding with a ferocity she didn't know she possessed, her psychic barriers crumbling as she surrendered to the purely physical. She felt the way his muscles coiled and released, the way his breath hitched when she ran her nails down his back, and the overwhelming surge of emotion that came with a human's total focus. As the hours passed, the diplomatic mission felt like a distant memory, a triviality compared to the discovery they were making in the dark. Elara realized that the Halian pursuit of mental perfection had left them hollow, a race of observers who had forgotten how to participate in their own existence. Silas, with his scars and his blood and his relentless drive, was more whole than any high priest she had ever known. "You're thinking again," Silas said softly, his voice thick with the aftermath of their passion. He was lying beside her, one arm draped over her waist, his thumb idly stroking the curve of her hip. "I am reflecting on the inefficiency of my people," Elara said, turning on her side to face him. "We have spent millennia trying to transcend the flesh, while you have spent yours mastering it," she added. "Mastering it is a strong word," Silas said, a tired smile playing on his lips. "We just embrace the mess," he said. "It is a beautiful mess," Elara replied, reaching out to trace the scar on his shoulder. "I suspect the galaxy is not ready for what happens when a human stops being a soldier and starts being a lover," she mused. "The galaxy isn't ready for a lot of things, Elara," Silas said, his expression turning serious. "But as long as we're down here, the galaxy doesn't matter," he added. He pulled her back into his arms, the scent of their union lingering in the air. The mission would continue tomorrow. There would be treaties to sign and wars to avert. But for now, there was only the steady beat of a human heart and the alien princess who had learned to listen to it. The dawn on Thalassa was not a sunrise, but a shifting of the deep blue water into a pale, translucent cyan. As the submersible began its ascent toward the surface, Silas and Elara sat together in the cockpit, their shoulders touching. The silence was different now. It was comfortable, a shared secret that fortified them for the challenges ahead. "The Council will sense the change in me," Elara said, her eyes fixed on the rising light. "My mental frequency has shifted," she noted. "Let them sense it," Silas said, his hand finding hers and squeezing firmly. "Let them see that humanity doesn't just break things," he said. "We build things too," Silas added. "Connections that your telepathy could never reach," he said. Elara looked at him, seeing not just the kinetic specialist or the human soldier, but a man who had redefined her entire understanding of reality. She realized that the humanity she had heard stories about, the reckless, emotional, tactile species, was exactly what her people needed to survive their own stagnation. "I believe," Elara said, a small smile appearing, "that I would like to visit Earth when this is over," she suggested. "The whole planet is a mess, Princess," Silas warned, though his eyes were bright with affection. "It's loud, it's crowded, and everyone is touching everything," he said. "Exactly," Elara said, leaning her head on his shoulder. "I think I have had enough of the quiet," she concluded. As the submersible broke the surface, the bright sun of the system flooded the cabin. Silas stood up, offering his hand to her with a formal bow that was undercut by the heat in his eyes. "Then let's go show them what they've been missing," Silas said. The hatch opened, and the sounds of the world rushed in, the crashing waves, the cry of seabirds, and the distant hum of shuttle engines. Elara stepped out onto the deck, her hand still firmly clasped in Silas's. She didn't look like a distant royal anymore. She looked like a woman who had finally found her place in the physical universe. The Halian guards waiting for them on the platform stiffened, their telepathic probes hitting a wall of human-influenced static emanating from their princess. They saw the oil stains on her dress and the way she stood, not with ethereal lightness, but with a grounded human posture. "Commander Silas," one of the guards said, his voice tight with confusion. "The princess is damp," he noted. Silas didn't miss a beat, his hand sliding possessively to the small of Elara's back as they walked past the stunned aliens. "She's not just damp, Sergeant," Silas said, his voice carrying across the deck. "She's alive," he added. Elara laughed, a sound so rich and textured it made the guards flinch. She looked back at Silas, her eyes glowing with the reflected light of the sun and the internal fire he had lit. "And I intend to stay that way," Elara said. The journey back to the flagship was a blur of protocol and preparation, but the connection between the two remained the focal point of every room they entered. The Halians looked at Silas with a mixture of fear and begrudging respect, sensing the raw power that lay beneath his casual demeanor. They saw the way he moved, not with the programmed grace of a machine, but with the reactive, intuitive flow of a predator that had learned to be gentle. In the days that followed, the treaty was signed, but the real victory was the shift in Halian culture. Elara began to demand more physical presence in her meetings, breaking the centuries-old tradition of telepathic projection. She spoke of the importance of the senses, of the data that could only be gathered through the skin and the heart. And always, Silas was at her side, a constant reminder of the human element that had saved her world and awakened her soul. On their final night, before Silas was scheduled to return to his sector, they stood on the observation deck of the flagship, looking out at the swirling nebula of the Reach. "You're going to miss me," Silas said, his tone teasing but his eyes searching hers. "It is a physical ache," Elara admitted, stepping into his space. "A human sensation I find quite inconvenient," she added. "Good," Silas said, pulling her into a final, lingering embrace. "It means I'm doing my job," he whispered. "You are more than your job, Silas," Elara said, looking up at him. "You are the proof that the universe is meant to be felt," she told him. As the human transport docked, Silas prepared to leave, but he stopped at the airlock, looking back one last time. "Remember, Princess," Silas said, a wink flashing in the dim light. "If the stars get too lonely, you know where the ground is," he reminded her. Elara watched the transport disappear into the dark, her hand resting over her heart. She could still feel the phantom heat of his touch, a permanent mark left by a species that refused to stay in the shadows. Humanity hadn't just impressed the Halians, they had changed the very nature of their existence, proving that in a galaxy of mind and spirit, there was nothing quite as powerful as a human touch. The legacy of their time on Thalassa spread through the sector, a story of a human who defied the depths and a princess who dared to feel. It became a new paradigm for HFY narratives, not just of technological might or tactical genius, but of a biological intensity that could bridge the gap between the stars. Silas and Elara remained the symbols of this new era, two beings from vastly different worlds who found a common language in the oldest way possible. Years later, when the first Halian embassy opened on Earth, the diplomat at the head of the delegation was none other than Elara. She stepped off the ship and onto the soil of her lover's home, her eyes searching the crowd. When she saw the familiar, rugged form of Silas waiting for her, she didn't wait for the ceremonial welcome. She ran, her iridescent silks fluttering in the wind, and threw herself into his arms. The humans cheered, and the Halians watched in silent awe as their princess embraced the mess of the world with everything she had. "You're late," Silas whispered into her ear, his arms locking around her like iron. "I was busy master the art of the physical," Elara replied, her face buried in his neck. "Show me," Silas said, his voice a promise of the many days to come. The story of the human and the alien became a legend, a testament to the fact that while technology could conquer space, it was only through the raw, unrefined power of human connection that the galaxy could truly be one. In every corner of the Reach, beings began to look at their own hands, wondering what it was like to truly touch the world they lived in. And somewhere, in a quiet corner of Earth, Silas and Elara continued their own exploration, one sensory detail at a time, proving that the most impressive thing about humanity was, and always would be, the way we love.